Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving headfirst into the really fascinating, sometimes quite perplexing world of global politics. It's a landscape where the actions, maybe even just the instincts, of a few key figures can send these huge shockwaves around the globe. Our starting point for this deep dive, well, it's those recent comments from Senator Lindsey Graham. He mentioned potential mega sanctions on Russia and said this was discussed with Donald Trump. And that kind of statement, well, for many of us, it just immediately sparks questions, doesn't it, about what's really driving decisions at, the highest levels. So our mission right now is to unpack these complex dynamics in modern geopolitics. We're going to focus on the motivations, the strategies, or sometimes maybe the surprising lack of strategy from powerful leaders. We're pulling our insights directly from a really recent in-depth interview with a leading expert on Russia and international affairs. And our goal here is to kind of extract the most important nuggets of knowledge.
We want to help you truly understand what's behind these global shifts, what's maybe often misunderstood, and how it all connects to the bigger picture. We've even got some surprising facts along the way to, well, keep you hooked. So let's get into it. Okay, first up, when we talk about Donald Trump's approach to Russia, and especially to Vladimir Putin, it often seems to, well, defy conventional geopolitical analysis. What's been observed is, less of a grand strategy maybe, and more of an unpredictable, almost moment-to-moment decision-making style. It seems often influenced by who he's currently speaking with and whether he thinks he's winning in that moment. So how does this unique style actually, manifest when dealing with a major power like Russia?
Well, it's that paradox you just highlighted, isn't it? It's fascinating. On one hand, you've got, I think the reports say over 80 senators willing to sign a bill for really quite dramatic sanctions against Russia. That's a significant consensus, politically speaking.
A huge majority.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, you have these forces within Trump's orbit, and maybe Trump himself, who seem much more open to striking deals with Putin. And the implication often is that these potential deals aren't really driven by national interest or some strategic alignment,
Right.
but maybe more by personal or, financial gain. And this isn't actually a new thing.
And it's not just recent speculation either, is it? We hear about Trump's Russian connections, but from your expertise, how deep do those ties actually go historically? I've seen mentions of, documented business investments going back decades. What's the reality there, and why does it matter for his approach now?
Yeah, it's really important to be clear here. This isn't some conspiracy theory. There is documented Russian investment into his various business ventures, and it goes back, well, more than 30 years. So this long-standing personal financial entanglement, rather than maybe a clear geopolitical ideology, it appears to be a pretty consistent thread running underneath his approach to Russia. And it often seems to override traditional diplomatic thinking. And what's more, his negative views on U.S. alliances, they aren't new either. They're not solely linked to Russia. We've seen these kinds of sentiments expressed very consistently. They go back to his books from the early 2000s.
They remember those.
And even, back to the 1980s, magazine advertisements where he argued the U.S. was just wasting money on alliances. Now, if you connect this to the bigger picture, he seems profoundly impressed by leaders who operate, well, without checks and balances, without restrictions, without courts, without journalists.
And constrained power.
Exactly. He really admires that kind of power. And what's particularly notable is his personal impression of Putin. He's actually used the word friend when talking about Putin. He doesn't usually do that for other world leaders.
That is a striking contrast, isn't it? He uses this word friend, yet seems to, well, ignore Russia's escalating attacks on Ukrainian civilians on infrastructure. And this is happening even while Russia itself has never actually said it wants a deal or a ceasefire. So how do you square that circle? Is it genuinely a blind spot? Or is there some kind of calculation behind that apparent inaction, even if it's, a self-serving one?
It's difficult to see it as a strategic calculation, certainly not in the traditional sense. When you look at Trump's language about his opponents, using terms like vermin or describing immigrants as poisoning the blood of the nation, language we have to remember that Hitler used. It points to a broader lack, perhaps, of empathy. Now, there was that one isolated incident, I recall, where he seemed quite warm to a Ukrainian journalist, but it's really doubtful a single moment like that would change such a deeply ingrained perspective. His worldview seems much less about global strategy and far more about personal power dynamics.
So it's almost a paradox then. His actions might sometimes please Putin, maybe unintentionally, and yet at the same time they can lead to things like European rearmament, so it isn't based on some grand geopolitical strategy. It seems more about his own self-focus, perhaps, and maybe, I don't know, a desire to be seen as a peacemaker even aiming for a Nobel Peace Prize.
Precisely. And this unique, very instinct-driven decision-making style coming from a major global player like a potential U.S. president,
Yeah.
well, it obviously impacts global stability. It completely reshapes the expectations of traditional diplomacy. So for you, the listener, the key takeaway here is that trying to anticipate responses from such a leader becomes incredibly difficult. It makes long-term alliances and predictable international relations much, much harder to gauge and, frankly, rely upon. Now, if we contrast that with Vladimir Putin, well, it's an entirely different story. Putin absolutely has a strategy, and it seems driven by three deeply overlapping goals. His first goal is, well, it's deeply imperial. He wants to resurrect the Russian Empire, positioning himself as its great historical leader.
Wow.
And this means erasing Ukrainianness, essentially, and incorporating Ukraine back into Russia, whether that's as a puppet government or just absorbing it fully. His initial plan, that highly ambitious 3-day plan for Kyiv and the 6-week plan for the whole country, well, it failed dramatically,
Spectacularly.
which led to this brutal Plan B basically undermining and destroying Ukraine as much as possible through sheer attrition. Then, his second goal, I'd call it a war of ideas. He wants to dismantle the very principles that drove the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution. Things like anti-corruption, rule of law, transparency, accountability.
The very things threatening his own system.
Exactly. He sees these ideas as a direct ideological threat, because if they succeed in Ukraine, they could easily inspire similar demands inside Russia itself, which would directly undermine his own autocratic system. And his third goal is this sweeping global geopolitical shift. Putin aims to basically dismantle the post-World War II international legal order. We're talking about the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions on Warfare, the UN Convention on Genocide.
Foundational principles.
Right. He envisions this multipolar world where basically might makes right, where strong countries can just invade weaker ones with impunity without these international rules getting in the way. And he's actively building up his military and crucially, his influence campaigns to expand Russia's power within this, well, deeply cynical vision.
That certainly sounds like a profound strategic framework, especially when you compare it to the unpredictability we were just discussing. But given Russia's initial military failures in Ukraine, how much of this framework is truly, proactive strategy versus maybe reactive adaptation to that unexpected resistance? And speaking of influence, which of the Kremlin's campaigns, in your view, have been the most successful in pushing these strategic goals forward?
It's definitely a mix. It's proactive strategy combined with reactive brutality, for sure. But those core goals, they've remained remarkably consistent, despite the setbacks on the battlefield. As for influence campaigns, well, measuring precise success is always tricky, isn't it? But the efforts to help build up the AfD in Germany, that's the far-right Alternative for Germany party, those have been pretty successful, arguably. But really, the most significant shift that's enabled all these campaigns is how political conversation has moved. It's moved from, real life to the online world, and crucially, from arguments about policy to arguments about identity. The internet created this global information space, which just makes it much easier for any actor to intervene anywhere. I mean, think about how similar political language can sound now, even in countries as different as, say, Poland and the United States.
Oh, right.
It's often because politics is increasingly conducted online in very similar ways that are ripe for outside influence. And what's particularly unique and, frankly, quite disturbing about Putin's propaganda is its almost entirely negative nature. It's not like Soviet-era propaganda that, promoted a positive communist vision, however flawed.
Right, it offered something.
Exactly. Putin's doesn't really offer a positive model for Russia or the world. Instead, it promotes cynicism, nihilism, and apathy. It aims to persuade people just to distrust their establishment, distrust their own political system, rather than promoting some viable alternative. And this purely negative, corrosive campaign, well, it turns out to be a little harder to fight because it's not about convincing you of something specific. It's just about undermining confidence in everything else.
That's a really crucial observation. So for you, the listener, when you consider these strategic goals, especially this war of ideas, and the deeply cynical negative propaganda, it raises a vital question, doesn't it? How might these tactics be directly impacting information, integrity, social cohesion in your own society? It's something we all really need to grapple with. as these aren't just battles happening far away.
Right. And then moving to the West, there are some significant blind spots in how Putin's Russia is often understood. There's frequently a failure to grasp the true extremism of Putinism.
Yeah.
This includes this persistent mistaken belief, I think, that some kind of deal, maybe involving giving up territory like Crimea, would somehow just end the conflict.
Appeasement, essentially.
Yes. But as we've discussed, Putin's goals are much, much broader and more ambitious than just territory. They involve, potentially, the destruction of the transatlantic alliance, maybe even the European Union itself. So the path of peace, then, it's not really through appeasement. It's through convincing Putin that he simply cannot win the war. And that primarily means consistently arming and defending Ukraine until he realizes his objectives are just unattainable. But then, on the flip side, Putin also has major blind spots about the West, and crucially about Ukraine itself. From the very beginning, he severely underestimated the Ukrainians.
Really?
He seems to know very little about modern Ukraine. He didn't understand their genuinely elected government, their strong national identity, or their, well, fierce willingness to fight back, even resorting to guerrilla warfare if necessary. And he consistently underestimated Europe's and the United States' ability and willingness to help Ukraine. He also underestimated the enduring power of ideas like unity and integrity that, bind these nations together, however imperfectly.
That mutual misunderstanding is quite striking, especially when you think about countries that share histories of Soviet influence. So why then do we see such varied reactions within Europe, particularly from countries like, say, Hungary and Slovakia, which seem to diverge quite sharply from the broader European stance?
Well, Hungary's position under Viktor Orban is relatively clear. His country is struggling economically,
Right.
and he seems to have made a very personal calculation to seek money and investment from Russia and China rather than fully aligning with Europe. It's important to note, though, there are significant protests against him within Hungary, so his stance isn't universally popular at home.
Okay.
Slovakia's situation is perhaps a bit more complicated. It's also linked to financial interests and specific leadership allegiances, but it's a newer phenomenon there. Now, from an external perspective, like the EU or NATO, well, you don't just expel countries.
Yeah.
But some argue that perhaps suspending Hungary's voting rights could be an option, given that it's arguably not acting as a good faith member committed to the alliance's core values.
Building on that point about Western responses, if we look at the broader geopolitical context, what other significant Western actions or strategies do you think are, well, currently missing or underdeveloped in countering these challenges effectively?
A major missing piece, I would argue, is a direct, robust information campaign to Russia, directed at Russians. We've imposed sanctions, for example, but we haven't really effectively explained them or explained Western motivations to the Russian people themselves.
That's the point.
While Russia and other autocratic countries spend millions analyzing us, influencing us, we spend almost nothing thinking about how to effectively influence or reach or just speak to ordinary Russians. For instance, the Trump administration actually disbanded the Global Engagement Center.
Right, I remember that.
It was a small State Department program specifically tasked with countering foreign propaganda and disinformation. That creates a significant asymmetry in this information war. However, there has been a really significant and positive shift in European defense thinking. That's crucial. There's now a genuine understanding right across the continent of the direct threat Russia poses, not just to Ukraine, but to Europe itself.
A real wake-up call.
Absolutely, and this has led to a much-needed increase in defense spending and also a necessary adaptation to what is a very high-tech drone war, a war where a lot of traditional heavy equipment is proving less useful than we thought. As the saying goes, peace does not have to mean pacifism, and that understanding is proving really crucial right now.
So, for you, the listener, considering these profound mutual misunderstandings and also this shift in European defense thinking, what immediate lessons can maybe be applied? How can we foster clearer communication and more effective, adaptable responses in these kinds of geopolitical crises? Understanding seems like the essential first step, doesn't it? Understanding both our adversaries and maybe ourselves. This whole discussion of global alliances, strategic miscalculations, internal strengths, it naturally brings us to the American political landscape, which often feels like its own complex ecosystem, deeply affecting these international dynamics. Now, from an outside perspective, it can sometimes look like the Republican Party is almost entirely, well, beholden to Trump, while maybe the Democratic Party seems to lack those really clear visionary leaders who appeal to the broadest sections of the population. How accurate is that perception, really?
That's actually a common European misconception, I think. To expect the U.S. system to have a single leader of the opposition, like you see in a parliamentary system.
Oh, okay. It works differently.
It just doesn't work that way. What we actually have is the emergence of maybe 10 to a dozen people who are building significant constituencies on the Democratic side. People like, Senator Chris Murphy, Pete Buttigieg,
Hmm.
governors from states like Kentucky, Illinois, Pennsylvania.
Hmm.
And we also saw that historic No Kings demonstration against Donald Trump that happened across all 50 states.
Right.
It was the largest national demonstration in American history. That shows a deep, widespread anti-autocratic sentiment that's often overlooked, I think. And it's also worth noting some Republicans are starting to dissent more,
Hmm.
or at least make passing legislation more difficult for a potential Trump agenda. There's definitely a segment of the party actively preparing for a future beyond his immediate term. But what's truly interesting, and maybe a bit disorienting for observers, is how U.S. politics has become much less to do with policies,
Yeah.
and far more about questions of which identity group do you belong to and which candidates represent your definition of yourself. This makes the whole political landscape far more volatile and unpredictable because it's driven by these deeply personal, often quite emotional identity affiliations rather than traditional policy debates.
As we talk about these shared threats, these information campaigns,
Mm.
it becomes pretty clear that many autocratic regimes, despite having very different ideologies, are kind of working from a common playbook, aren't they?
Yeah.
Which leads us directly to what some experts are calling autocracy incorporated. This group of nations like China, Iran, Putin's Russia, they have vastly diverse ideologies, communist, theocratic, nationalism. They share this common thread. They all view the language of Western democracy, things like accountability, transparency, rule of law, independent courts, free media. They see that language itself as a direct threat to their power. And they're actively trying to undermine it globally.
Yeah, absolutely. And to fight back effectively, the West really needs to focus on two key areas, I believe. First, we absolutely must address our own internal weaknesses. That means pushing back aggressively against things like shell companies and tax havens, making sure the wealthiest are taxed fairly, eliminating dark money in politics.
Cleaning our own house.
Precisely. Democratic nations need to collectively fight kleptocracy much more effectively because this corruption often directly fuels the very autocratic regimes we're concerned about. And second, we need to seriously look at regulating the internet. Now, not as censorship,
Right, that's a key distinction.
but by making the rules transparent. Considering forms of social media that aren't purely manipulated by advertising companies and ensuring people have access to evidence-based conversation and just, well, better information. These internal fixes, addressing our own vulnerabilities, would go a very, very long way in shoring up democratic resilience against these external pressures.
So, how might understanding this profound shift towards identity politics and recognizing these shared threats posed by autocratic regimes, how might that influence how you, listening now, engage with information and perceive these global challenges?
It really shifts the nature of the battleground, doesn't it? From a purely military or economic one to one that's fought fiercely on the terrain of ideas and information. So this deep dive, it truly aimed to give you a shortcut to being, well, better informed about the complex forces shaping our world. From the often unpredictable instincts of some major players to the deeply calculated strategic goals of others.
And we've really highlighted the critical need for the West to understand both the broad, ambitious external challenges it faces and also the internal strengths it absolutely needs to shore up to effectively navigate this turbulent and, let's face it, uncertain global landscape. So here's a final thought. In a world where politics seems increasingly driven by identity, and where information campaigns often aim to spread cynicism rather than promote ideals, how can we as individuals and as societies actively cultivate critical thinking? And how can we foster genuine understanding across divides, both at home and globally? Something to consider long after this deep dive ends. Until next time, stay curious.